My name is Jocelyn. I am currently 28 years old and work at an advertising agency located a bit away from the hustle and bustle of the city. From a young age, I have always been a hard worker, forging my own path with my own efforts. In contrast, my younger sister, Alexandra, was considered the golden child by our mother. No matter what Alexandra did, our mother doted on her and forgave everything. I have often felt frustrated by the difference in how we were treated. When Alexandra acted selfishly, it was met with a laugh and a dismissive, "She's just a child," while I was scolded too, "Be patient, you're the older sister." Gradually, I felt like I lost my place within our family and learned to endure in silence. A definitive rift in our relationship occurred after our father passed away. Our mother's adoration for Alexandra only intensified, fueling her dependency. Meanwhile, I dropped out of college to support our family's finances and gradually became isolated within the family. My mother and Alexandra would laugh together when I was not around, and I was treated like air even when I returned home. I eventually decided to leave home when I turned 25. I had longed to escape the loneliness and conflicts I felt within the family. Unable to find my place at home, I was determined to establish myself in the outside world. I saved money and finally started living on my own. I built a new life base within walking distance to the company. Since leaving home, I naturally distanced myself from my mother and sister. Initially, it was to heal the dissatisfaction and frustration I had held inside. Gradually, my relationship with Alexandra began to change, and the tense atmosphere seemed slightly alleviated when I visited home. However, remnants of resentment still lingered in my heart. Then, last Thanksgiving Day, I met with my mother and Alexandra after a long time. My mother served us warm dishes, and Alexandra, true to her nature, was all smiles. However, what surprised me that day was suddenly hearing from Alexandra about her upcoming marriage. "Jocelyn, actually, I'm getting married next week," Alexandra said, looking embarrassed. My mother simply smiled without saying a word. A mix of emotions crossed my mind. The invitation, just a week in advance, brought both surprise and bewilderment. But at the same time, there was a faint sense of relief deep inside. I still feel somewhere that my mother's love was unfair. Watching my mother's joyous reaction to Alexandra's marriage, I was once again reminded of the unchanged weight of that love. My mother continued to be overprotective towards Alexandra, and I felt somewhat adrift in the midst of that. I asked Alexandra, "Why didn't you tell me about the marriage sooner? We're family." My words overflowed, and I inadvertently raised my voice. Alexandra looked surprised, hesitating a bit before responding. "Sorry, Jocelyn. But you seemed busy since you moved out, and it was hard to tell you. I didn't want to burden you." Her excuse made me feel a tightening in my chest. "So why didn't you tell me sooner? Why all of a sudden? A wedding next week?" I continued, feeling angry. Alexandra was at a loss for words and looked down. Then, my mother, looking at Alexandra, gently smiled and said, "Jocelyn, try to understand what Alexandra was feeling. You haven't been home or in touch, so there wasn't a good time to tell you. It couldn't be helped." My mother's words sounded like they were shielding Alexandra. I was left speechless on the spot. Standing between my mother and Alexandra, I couldn't shake the feeling of being excluded. No matter how hard I tried, was I always just an outsider looking in? Unable to accept that, I quietly left the scene. The night I learned the wedding was next week, I spent it with complex emotions. While I had feelings of celebrating Alexandra's happiness, there was also a whirl of unease and conflict within me. No tears came, but I felt something welling up inside. It was the wall of emotions I had built over the past. Never truly cherished within the family, I felt sad, poignant, and unbearably lonely. As the wedding day approached, I felt the need to sort out my feelings. I wanted to celebrate Alexandra's marriage, but at the same time, I had to reassess my place within the family. Could I ever feel the happiness my mother and Alexandra do? Or am I doomed to remain isolated within the family forever? Gradually, I felt a strong desire not to attend the wedding. On the wedding day, I entered the venue feeling as if I had been left behind in a distant past. The hall, adorned in elegance, was enveloped in the soft light of chandeliers, filled with the smiling faces and cheerful voices of guests. After adjusting the hem of my dress, I took a deep breath and approached the reception. I received the seating chart, but my name was nowhere to be found. Feeling as though my presence was not even allowed, a sense of unrest stirred within me. Confused, I inadvertently asked a nearby staff member, who looked a bit surprised and then guided me saying, "Your seat is over here." As I took my seat at the very edge of the venue, in a corner as if hidden from everyone's notice, I was struck by the placement and overwhelmed by indescribable emotions. Moreover, the edge of the place card was slightly bent, clearly treated carelessly. The moment I picked up the card with trembling fingers, my heart froze. The waitress. I blinked several times, rechecking the words, but there it was, unmistakably written. My fingers trembled and my knees felt like they could give way at any moment. A shock as if my very existence was being denied coursed through my body. "What is this?" My murmured voice was hoarse, reaching no one. However, at that moment, I heard footsteps creeping up from behind. When I turned around, there stood Alexandra in her wedding dress, looking as if she was a scene from a movie, beautiful yet her smile was as cold as ice. "Do you like it?" Her voice carried a hint of malice. I gasped, clutching the card as I stared at her. "What does this mean?" Alexandra snorted through her nose. "It means exactly what it says. You're not really part of our family. I thought being a waitress suits you." My mind went blank. I opened my mouth to retort, but no sound came out. Then, feeling someone's gaze, I looked to the side and saw my mother standing there. She didn't even glance at me but instead smiled kindly at Alexandra. "You truly look wonderful, Alexandra. Your mother is so proud to see you like this." She acted as if I didn't exist. At that moment, everything clicked. My mother knew about this insult. She even seemed to be enjoying it. The loneliness and alienation I had endured for years surged from the depths of my heart. "What do you mean I'm not family?" I finally managed to choke out the words. But my mother just gave me a cold glance and said nothing. Instead, Alexandra shrugged and answered, "Well, you've always been different from us, haven't you? Besides, after Dad died, you were hardly home and moved out after a while. It's troubling if you act like family now." After my father's death, I had worked relentlessly to support the family. My reduced time at home wasn't due to dwindling love but to protect them. Yet, why must I endure such treatment? I bit my lip in frustration but didn't let the tears flow. Showing tears would mean I'd play right into their hands. I gripped the card, taking a quiet breath. Cold anger began to rise from the depths of my heart. "I see. I understand now." Leaving those words behind, I turned my back. I could hear Alexandra giggling behind me, but it no longer mattered. I wasn't going to let them defeat me. I couldn't be trampled on any longer. I moved to a corner of the venue and pulled out my smartphone. On it was a file that served as evidence of my revenge against Alexandra. In fact, Mandy, my colleague and a friend of Alexandra's, had informed me 3 months ago that Alexandra was getting married. However, I received no communication about it. Feeling indignation, I had resolved to retaliate against Alexandra. I began to subtly probe around Alexandra's circle. It started with mere gossip but gradually more surprising information came to light. There were whispers among friends that Alexandra had been seen getting cozy with a man other than her fiancé. At first, it was hard to believe, but then Mandy informed me about it directly. Actually, the story she started telling me was beyond my imagination. Despite being engaged, Alexandra had been having secret meetings with another man. What was even more shocking was learning from Mandy that Alexandra had been stealing money from our mother. Mandy once overheard Alexandra saying, "Mom's money is like my money. I can use what's in her account freely." When Mandy questioned, "Is that really okay?" Alexandra dismissed it with, "It's fine, we're family." The evidence I had gathered with Mandy's help was crammed into that small device. When I heard about the wedding a week ago, I acted as if it was the first I'd heard of it and quietly left the house. But inside, I had already decided what I needed to do. I took a deep breath, calming my heart. I couldn't be swayed by emotions here. I would calmly and surely rectify this humiliation. As the reception began and the guests chatted merrily, a heavy, indescribable weight pressed on my chest. The place card, my mother's cold smile, Alexandra's words. The emotions I had suppressed were gradually swelling inside. Suddenly, when the host prompted, "Would anyone like to say a few words to the bride and groom?" I stood up. I couldn't just leave silently. I couldn't simply watch their perfectly crafted stage with a nonchalant face. I quietly stepped in front of the microphone. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on me. Clutching the microphone with trembling hands, I took a deep breath. "Thank you all for gathering here today. I am Jocelyn, Alexandra's sister." I began speaking slowly. "It's such a wonderful wedding. However, there is something I must share with everyone here." I connected my smartphone to the screen and displayed photos of Alexandra cheating. One was a photo of Alexandra kissing another man. To obtain this evidence, I had hired a detective. Then, I played an audio recording of a conversation where Alexandra was discussing with Mandy how she freely used our mother's money as her own. The guests' voices of astonishment echoed throughout the venue. "What is this?" the groom exclaimed, his face turning pale. My mother stood up, looking at me in shock while listening to the audio that filled the room. She was seeing for the first time that Alexandra had been stealing money from her own account, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. Still, I continued speaking with a firm demeanor. I wanted everyone to celebrate knowing the truth. The venue erupted into chaos, and Alexandra broke down in tears. At that moment, the groom, shaking with anger, stood up and yelled at Alexandra. "What does this mean, Alexandra? Explain yourself." I quietly set down the microphone. This was my revenge. As the wedding descended into disarray, I left the venue. The cold night air caressed my cheeks as I took a deep breath. A mix of anger and emptiness swirled within me, my mind still full of the recent turmoil. Alexandra's screams, the groom's shouts of anger, and my mother's shocked face were all etched into my memory. The next day, Alexandra called me. She vehemently criticized me. "Why did you do that? The wedding is all ruined because of you." But I responded coolly. "I just told everyone the truth. You were the one who ruined it yourself, didn't you?" I hadn't realized that my words would ignite her anger even further. Afterward, I was away on a business trip for a few days. When I returned, the front door was ajar. Feeling my heart pound like a drum, I cautiously stepped inside the house. The room was terribly ransacked. Items from the shelves were scattered on the floor, picture frames were broken, and a painting I cherished was also shattered on the floor. I immediately called the police. While waiting for them to arrive, I carefully assessed the situation without moving anything. Then, among the shards of a broken vase scattered on the living room floor, I noticed a small silver charm that stood out. It was part of a bracelet that Alexandra always wore, and when I picked up the charm, my chest fluttered with anxiety. I wondered if this might indicate something, but I still had no proof. Eventually, the police arrived, and I explained the situation in the room. After a thorough inspection, the police began to review the surveillance camera footage. Watching the footage with them, Alexandra's figure was clearly captured entering my house late at night. Seeing this, my heart turned cold. The footage served as evidence, and the police began to act on the assumption that Alexandra was the perpetrator. While the police proceeded with their formalities, I consulted with a lawyer named George about the legal steps to take next. After reviewing the surveillance footage, he quietly said, "This is a clear case of illegal entry. If we find evidence of theft, legal action can be taken." I was resolved. I would not forgive Alexandra. She had not only insulted me but also committed a crime. Days later, George and I went to the police station and formally filed a complaint. My anger gradually turned into a calm determination, and I quietly awaited the day to deliver justice to Alexandra. The day the summons arrived, Alexandra stormed into my workplace. The sound of her heels echoed in the quiet office, and everyone's eyes turned toward us. With an angry expression, Alexandra stared at me and raised her voice. "Jocelyn, what have you done?" Her voice was trembling, but it was laced with definitive anger. I stood up from my desk and answered calmly. "What have I done? I simply sought justice." Alexandra paused for a moment, then her emotions exploded. "Justice? It all started because you ruined my wedding." To that, I replied calmly, yet with conviction. "Ruined your wedding? That was your own doing." Alexandra appeared shocked for a moment, but soon her face turned red as she attempted to retort. "But you..." I cut her off and continued. "What you did was a crime. Not only did you steal our mother's money, but you also broke into my room and ransacked it. The evidence has already been submitted to the police. Now it's up to the court to decide." She collapsed to her knees. I quietly returned to my seat and resumed my work. Weeks later, the day of the trial arrived. I stood at the witness stand and presented the surveillance footage. As the image of Alexandra breaking into my room was displayed on the courtroom screen, the gallery murmured. The verdict was guilty. Alexandra received a suspended sentence and was ordered to pay damages to me. After the trial, Alexandra turned to me, her anger seeping through her condemnation. "Why did you do this? Are you satisfied after suing your family like this?" Her attitude suggested she saw herself as the victim, which left me speechless. Alexandra never acknowledged her mistakes to the end and left with a resentful glare. I watched her leave and sighed deeply. Then, I quietly exited the courtroom. After the trial, I felt the tension that had been stretched tight within me finally begin to relax. Legal sanctions had been imposed on Alexandra, justice had been served, and a new chapter in my life was about to begin. About a week after the trial, I received a call from my mother. "Jocelyn, I've decided to sue Alexandra to recover the money she stole from me. She is no longer my daughter. You are my only child." I was taken aback by her words. It was the first time I had heard my mother speak critically of Alexandra. No matter how much trouble Alexandra caused in the past, my mother had never blamed her and always defended her. "Do what you think is best, Mom." I could hear her catch her breath on the other end of the phone. But she quickly suggested in a lighter tone, "Once I get the money back, let's go on a trip together." I tightened my grip on the receiver. "Mom, that's not right, is it?" I said quietly. There was a long silence before my mother asked in a puzzled voice. "What? What's wrong?" I took a deep breath and chose my words as calmly as possible. "The fact that Alexandra did what she did is her own responsibility, of course. But don't you share the blame, too? You've always pampered her, letting her believe that she could do anything and still be forgiven." I sensed my mother was about to say something, but I continued. "Getting your money back might be important, but that alone won't change anything. I could hear her breathing over the phone. She probably understood what I was trying to say. I know. I've been too indulgent with Alexandra. I realize that I've been terrible to you too. I remained silent, not responding to her words. It felt like the impact of my mother's role in the strained relationship between Alexandra and I had only now become clear. But even though I had sought justice against Alexandra, I hadn't yet come to terms with my feelings towards my mother. I've corrected justice against Alexandra, but that doesn't mean I've forgiven you. I'm not generous enough to forgive how you've treated me so quickly. I'm going to live on my own now, and you should too. With those final words, I hung up the phone. Subsequently, emails from my mother arrived daily, expressing regret and a desire to make amends. The emails were filled with words of remorse like, "I'm sorry, please give me just one more chance," and, "I deeply regret hurting you." I couldn't tell if my mother was genuinely remorseful or truly wanted me back. However, the accumulated past events meant that her words did not resonate with me. I never replied to her, simply continuing to ignore her communications quietly. Eventually, I blocked her contact information. It felt too late for her to understand the pain I had felt then. A new life awaited me. Determined not to be bound by past relationships, I resolved to move forward. At work, my colleagues supported me. During lunch, many commented, "You did nothing wrong," and, "It's good that justice prevailed." Their support was incredibly uplifting. Fueled by their encouragement, I dedicated myself to my work and gradually regained my routine. One day, I received a letter. The sender was Alexandra. To Jocelyn. I have lost everything. I now regret trying to take revenge on you. But it's too late, isn't it? Mom has abandoned me too. I am beyond forgiveness. I hope you find happiness. That's the least I can do to make amends. Alexandra. After reading the letter, I was nearly overwhelmed by complex emotions. Should I accept her apology, or should I just cut off the past and move forward? The answer was not easy to find. Months later, I was at a party celebrating the success of a new project. Holding a glass, I surveyed the venue and spotted a familiar back. Approaching, I realized it was Alexandra, who was working as a waitress at the party venue. She looked utterly exhausted, a far cry from her former glamorous self. Her complexion was poor, and fatigue was evident around her eyes. She desperately smiled while serving drinks to guests, but her smile carried a hint of emptiness. I watched her for a while, and our eyes met several times as she moved busily around. Alexandra looked surprised for a moment but quickly averted her gaze and continued her work. A strange feeling welled up in my chest. Then, Mandy approached me. "It seems Alexandra broke off her engagement with Kevin," she informed me. Mandy started speaking quietly, a look of concern apparent on her face. I couldn't respond to her immediately. She then continued. "Since the trial, Alexandra seems to have been struggling with debt. Additionally, Kevin has demanded alimony from her, and it seems like she's really cornered. She even asked me for a loan. It looks like she's juggling several jobs besides this one." Hearing about Alexandra's struggling to repay debts and working desperately evoked complex feelings in me. However, this was all the retribution she deserved. What she had done should not be forgiven. I glanced at Alexandra momentarily. The irony of her working as a waitress now, after she had mockingly called me one at the wedding, was not lost on me. It must be painfully clear to her now how much she has hurt and betrayed others. While continuing to talk with Mandy, I hoped that Alexandra would reflect on her past actions and live a more honorable life moving forward. I also learned that my mother was mentally cornered. A relative mentioned that she had not stepped out of the house at all and was shut in. Hearing that relatives were concerned about her didn't evoke any sympathy in me. Both Alexandra's betrayal and my mother's situation were consequences of their own actions, and I believe my mother should accept that. As for me, I think my mother needs to overcome her challenges on her own, and if she can't resolve her own suffering, that too is her problem. Reconciliation with my family now seems too difficult. The path I should walk is one free from the shadows of family, where I can value myself. From now on, I intend not to be bound by others' expectations or a sense of obligation, but to pursue my own happiness. Regardless of my family's situation, I am resolved to make my life a happy one. Without dwelling on the past, taking a new step forward and living at my own pace feels like the best course for me. My life is in my hands. I want to seize happiness with my own efforts and create days that truly satisfy me.